So we'll get started here. So Yali Madad and good evening, everyone. My name is Shaez Allidina, and I'm the chairman of the Aga Khan Economic Planning Board for British Columbia. We're so grateful and excited to have all of you participate in this evening's webinar, which is going to feature an expert group of panelists from Deloitte, and to discuss a topic that's on the future of trust and navigating to thrive. Before we get started, I'll provide a bit of background and context on this webinar. So this is essentially the second webinar in our three-part series on the future of business with Deloitte, where we hope to receive practical advice relating to responding, recovering, and thriving to new normal, as well as exploring the future of trust in the workplace and understanding the current challenges that CEOs are facing. Next week in the series finale, we will be able to explore what is needed to manage business continuity, reintegration into the workplace, and confront challenges faced in the post-pandemic world. To give you some context and background, the Economic Planning Board will continue to provide further programming and resources for businesses to really understand and respond during this challenging time. Respond to the future of business, including a key initiative to provide strategic advisory services for business owners. We will continue to build such resources to ensure the Jamaat and business owners in particular have access to knowledge and support during this difficult time. Just a bit of a disclaimer before we begin, all these discussions during the course of this webinar are views and opinions of the speakers themselves, and it's important to understand that it does not necessarily reflect the views of their employees or their affiliates. The information provided does not constitute financial, legal, tax, or investment recommendations or advice. Now, without further ado, I'd like to begin by introducing the wonderful panel of experts here we have from Deloitte. Our first panelist is Jennifer Lee. Jennifer is the Canadian Managing Partner, Growth Platforms for Deloitte Canada and Chile. She is leveraging her experience in building new practices and transforming businesses by tackling important issues in the marketplace. She oversees growth platforms such as Future of Trust, climate change, and preparing businesses to thrive in a post-COVID world. Jennifer is also the Global Managing Partner for Global Financial Advisory, Clients and Industries, a business that focuses on developing and delivering Deloitte's global advisory go-to-market strategy. Most recently, Jennifer led Deloitte's global COVID response, developing the Resilient Leadership Platform, which elevated Deloitte to its #1 ranking globally on thought leadership. Jennifer is also a practicing partner and advises consumer brands and retailers in Canada and globally on growth and transformation strategies. Our next panelist is Fatima Laher. Fatima is the board director of the Canadian and Chilean firms and a global lead client service partner. She brings pragmatic advice to all clients she serves. Furthermore, she is the lead Canadian partner for a broad range of multinational clients. Recognized for her strong tax technical and cross-border compensation expertise, Fatima enjoys the trusted advisory status with her clients. She is known in the market for her expertise in global mobility consulting and has written several papers. She has been recognized as one of the top 10 female tax partners in Canada for 4 consecutive years. And our final panelist, Raman Rai. Raman joined Deloitte in 2017 as a financial services consulting leader, having spent 17 years with the HSBC Group as a senior commercial banking executive, based out of London, UK. Raman has held a range of leadership positions, including global head of business banking. She grew up in a family which thrived on entrepreneurship and building businesses, which has really steamed and motivated her passion. She's an active member and prides herself on elevating diversity, on thought through proactive sponsorship and inclusive leadership. Throughout this webinar, we're going to hear a great abundance of knowledge and expertise from these experts. So please have your questions ready throughout the webinar using the chat function. and we will have the final portion of this webinar devoted to Q&A. I will now kindly hand it over to Jennifer Lee.
Thank you, Shaez. Thank you so much to the Ismaili community for having us here today. We're so excited to be having our second part of the series on navigating to thrive. As Shaez mentioned, I just recently completed leading Deloitte's global COVID response for the firm to help guide our clients and our industry leaders through what is seemingly a pandemic that has become part of the new normal. When I reflect on the time that we spoke to CEOs around the world, there are two big discussions that came up. One is, how does a leader preserve, maintain trust as they try to navigate their business from a responding to recovering and eventually to a thriving business in a post-COVID world? The two topics that we're going to speak about today is around the future of trust, and Raman then will take us into how do you prepare and position your business to thrive in a post-COVID world. We hope you enjoy the thinking that we've brought together today. This is a culmination of not only the thought leadership of the partners here on the phone, but hundreds of conversations that we've had with our other clients, and we welcome your questions. So we'll begin first with the future of trust, and my esteemed colleague Fatima Laher is going to join us, and then we'll move over to have a discussion with Raman. If you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. So what is trust, and why is this important in a post-COVID world? When we were developing the Resilient Leadership platform to help explain to our clients the phases that you're going to have to take your business through to eventually achieve a thriving business in a post-COVID world, this discussion around trust came up. And as the economy begins to recover and reopen and rebuild, trust will be critical for leaders to exhibit, to develop followership. And how do you think about trust? How do you make it tangible for your business? There's 4 dimensions of trust that we developed in partnership with Harvard Business School as we were speaking to CEOs around the world. And these 4 elements were universal, regardless of country, culture, and area of focus. It's physical safety, psychological, emotional safety, financial safety, and also digital safety. And that is a topic that those are 4 dimensions that need to be tied to each of the leaders. Trust has never been more important in the world. Unless you've been really hiding during COVID, you'll see that on the front of every paper around the world, the discussion around trust has become a pivotal point where country leaders, economies, CEOs, even small businesses are trying to grapple with this topic. And the drivers of trust have been shaken in this pandemic world. And so now the ability to bring together the confidence of the customer, the confidence of our employees, our shareholders, our communities will really be centered about how we define and execute on trust. You can go to the next slide. I mentioned earlier that Deloitte has a strategic partnership with one of the top professors at Harvard Business School called Sandra Suker. And when we collaborated with her to build our Future of Trust platform, she defined trust as a willingness to be vulnerable to the actions of others because we believe that they have good intentions and will behave well towards us. If you take this thinking and this framework and just apply it to what we're seeing down in the US, it really becomes a guiding light and a guiding principle to how you evaluate leaders and their trust towards us to have good intentions and whether they're competent enough to deliver on those intentions. Sandra wrote a very important piece called Broken Trust, and she also wrote something called The Trust Crisis, which we used as our foundational thinking as for what Fatima is going to take us through next. Fatima, over to you.
Thanks, Jen. One of the important things to note is under Jen's leadership, the Deloitte organization invested a significant amount of time in research. She spoke about the Harvard Business Review. She also speaks about 7,500 clients and consumers that were interviewed for us to come up with a framework that we think makes a significant impact in terms of understanding trust. On this particular slide, you see some examples of things in the media where trust is broken. Some of the examples, and I'll pick on the first one, the Wells Fargo CEO. I think recently you heard him making a flippant comment when he was challenged about why there was lack of diversity in his organization. He turned it on and made a comment that he didn't have access to a lot of diverse candidates, only then to face a significant backlash of his organization. When sometimes people in senior leadership positions make comments like that, trust can be broken instantly. I don't have to labor the point. We all know what's happening in the context of just the whole diversity and inclusion agenda. And what I will try and endeavor to do is share with you the framework that we've come out and how that actually comes to life. As part of the research that was done, it will be surprising, and I'd like Jen to probably step in here as well. As we conducted the reviews, we found out that certain industries, which will be no surprise to you, ranked favorably and some didn't. So organizations or companies in the technology sector were typically low ranking in terms of how the public and shareholders viewed them from a trust perspective. But then you have certain other organizations that were probably better. And it was interesting under the pandemic that government's trust index went higher. And sometimes I do wonder whether it had to do with a lot of the bailout money that most companies around the world were focusing on. Jen, do you want to comment a little bit on some of the study that we did and how the different industry sectors ranked?
Absolutely. When we were studying organizations, we were trying to create the link between a trusted organization and shareholder value. And I'll give you some statistics that will just help bring it to life. So you think, well, trust is an esoteric topic. How does it really translate to dollars? Well, let me lay this out for you. In our study, 62% of consumers who reported highly trusting a brand buy almost exclusively from that brand for that category. Brands matter, and in this world where there's uncertainty, consumers are looking for comfort, and they can find comfort in brands that they recognize and that they trust. Employees who view their employer as highly trustworthy are half as likely to seek new job opportunities as those who don't. So if you want to reduce churn of employees in your business, being seen and viewed as a trustworthy leader matters. It translates into dollars. The cost of training new employees is substantial. And if you're seeing high churn, you've got to figure out a way to retain your talent. I will also close that customers who trust a brand, 88% buy again from that brand, and 73% have tried a new product or service from that brand. So not only do they buy your core product, but they buy other categories that complement your product. And a lack of trust costs businesses $2.5 trillion per year.
Thanks, Jen. So let's talk a little bit about the framework. How I envisage this is, Jen mentioned physical, emotional, digital, and financial, but how does this come to life?
There's 4 dimensions of trust, as I mentioned earlier, and it's multidimensional. So as leaders are thinking about executing trust framework in your organization, you should be asking yourself 4 questions. Do I engender physical trust? Trust that your physical space is safe and will not cause harm to any of your employees, and you're investing in the space for your customers and your employees to be in a safe environment. The second area of questioning would be, are you creating an emotional and psychologically safe environment? Do employees trust that their emotional and societal needs are being safeguarded? So does it mean that you're in an environment where you can speak up and provide your views without being cast aside? That you can bring a diverse view to the table. You can ask the right questions to help push a business problem forward, regardless of what level you are in the organization. And are you creating an environment for growth and development of an individual? The third area is around financial safety. Do your employees and your people and your communities feel that their financial concerns or needs are being served? Are you paying them a fair wage? An example is during COVID, the grocery sector increased wage by $2 because they recognized that people were putting their lives at risk by serving in their grocery stores. That's an example of bringing financial safety. And then finally, digital safety. In a world of hacking where your personal information can be easily stolen, are you providing digital safety to your employees and to your customers? Do they trust that their information with you is secure and it won't be used against them? Or somebody could steal their information and share it along the dark web? And cybersecurity, are you investing in the cybersecurity to protect your people? These 4 dimensions are critical dimensions to building trust. Over to you, Fatima.
Thanks, Jen. So in the context of financial trust, I wanted to give the example of what's actually happening more in Canada and globally. Everyone is totally familiar with the government subsidies, government bailouts, the CERB. In the context of organizations and individuals availing themselves of the money, you've got to be extremely careful that you've looked at it from this particular angle. Are you really entitled to it? You may, under the definition of certain criteria, be eligible to get the money, but is it really meant for you? You're seeing recent examples in the papers where CRA or Canada Revenue Agency are basically saying they're going to publicly declare all organizations and individuals that have availed themselves of the money. We also saw what happened in the US where Shake Shack, they didn't do anything wrong. They actually qualified for a loan of $10 million. And when the public realized that this was really going to Shake Shack, who has very wealthy shareholders, there was significant backlash against the organization. In the context of this framework, anytime as an individual, a senior executive, a board member, or an organization is making a decision, you want to think about all these different elements in the context of trust, because we do say trust right now is the currency of business. Once broken, it is very, very difficult to regain. COVID has also showed us, under the current pandemic, it actually has put a spotlight on a lot of issues, right? Some things are very societal, they're social. And we also have found that people have more time to pay attention to information that's in the media. I'll give examples of large organizations, and I'll bring it back again to diversity and inclusion. Large organizations can no longer say, we don't have talent. They've got to really look at their organization structures. And if people are not aware, both Facebook and Oracle, their boards of directors have been sued. There's been a lawsuit against them in the context of not doing enough around diversity and inclusion, and what they are doing internally and the public statements they make is not aligned. Now, obviously, this has not come before the courts yet, but you can understand the anguish and anxiety that the organizations go through. Other examples are also things like CEOs that are being assessed not only for the work they do in an organization, no matter how competent they are, but in their personal lives. There's the recent example of Centerplate, where a CEO was in his private apartment building, enters into an elevator. Unbeknownst to him, there is a camera in it. He kicks his dog. The superintendent of the building is an animal activist, and this thing the video goes viral, and the CEO is asked to leave the organization. So in the context of all of this, you can see how important it is that individuals, their character, their contributions in terms of business and society matters. What you've got to focus on as well is who are the stakeholders in any decision that you're making. Historically, in organizations, we generally focused on shareholder wealth. That is not sufficient going forward. So when we talk about trust or the future of trust, you really do have to think about what is the history you want to leave, because everything is documented and you basically leave a digital footprint.
I'll just wrap up with a few thoughts. And this is a quote that we thought as a team resonated clearly with the CEOs that we spoke to. Trust is like the air we breathe. When it's present, nobody really notices, but when it's absent, everybody notices. This is a standard that CEOs now and leaders are being held to. In a world where governments may not be seen as the most trusted source, where communities are looking to organizations to create jobs and wealth in their communities, employees are seeing that they need to be purposely and morally aligned to the organization that they work for, and customers will now buy with purpose. And shareholders are now just part of the constituency, not the primary constituent. This complexity has created a challenge for the CEO or a leader, creating a question about, how do I do this? How do I be a trusted organization? And what Raman's going to talk about next is trust with resilience. Those two together create a winning combination to thrive. Just go to the next slide. I'll just wrap up before I transfer it over to Raman, that the greatest danger in the times of turbulence is not the turbulence itself, but to act with yesterday's logic. Then the thinking that you're going to see that Raman has going to lead us through, is really about mindset shift. How do you become a leader that has a mindset towards thriving your business and your people, your communities, your shareholders, and your employees into a new world? Raman, over to you.
Thanks so much, Jennifer and Fatima. And on behalf of both of them and myself, I'll just say it again. We are absolutely delighted to be here today and spend some time with the entire community. So thank you for having us here. I'm going to take you through the next chapter. So as you've kind of heard, the first half of our presentation today has very much been grounded on something that we've spent quite a considerable amount of time thinking about. It cuts across every single industry and every single sector. Moving the chapter forward, I will be able to share with you a little bit of what we here at Deloitte have experienced ourselves, how we've organized the chapters that we have just walked through when it comes to the last 8 months of COVID-19. But more importantly, we're going to spend a good amount of time on thriving. So helping to guide the decisions as individuals and also as organizations across Canada when you think about the next chapter. As we describe it, we say it, new normal, it's here to stay. It is just simply the new. On this screen here, what you can see is the chapters through which we organized our actual COVID response. So we organized it first and foremost with a significant priority for our people. In the respond phase, it was heads down and making sure that our people felt safe and secure in whatever it is that they were doing, whether it was with clients or whether it was in their own personal lives. The second phase of that was very much around recovery. And it wasn't thinking through too far in the future, but very much focusing in on the medium term, assessing both the human impact to our business, but also thinking through what does this then mean in terms of the operating environment and decisions that needed to be made across the spectrum of choices in front of us. And as I said, the third phase, which we're excited to share with you today, is all about thriving. And we're going to spend a bit of time now helping to shape that path forward. Thrive to us is very much the moment where you get to look up, look around, and have a thoughtful process through which you can determine what's next for you as a leader, but more importantly, what's also next for you as an organization, if you're running an organization or happen to be running your own business. Go to the next slide, please. Just as that's coming up, a little bit of a path and a journey to go on when you think about moving from recovery to thrive. That path itself is charted with 3 main steps from our perspective. As Jen has mentioned previously, it is very much a mindset change. And while we speak about the organization's mindset, we all do truly believe it is also the individual's mindset across the organization, whether you're in leadership positions or whether you're in the organization itself, contributing to the overall value creation of that business. So chapter 1 is all going to be around the mindset shift, and I'll take you through that in just a second. Chapter 2 is all about understanding the terrain. The environment is so significantly different. That's not something that I need to belabor at this point in time, but I will say, looking at the individual sectors and impacts across the entire terrain that's now in front of us is critically important when you think about that path ahead towards Thrive. And then the third one is architecting the future. Deep, detailed investment of time as a leadership team, or for yourself as a family, or as an individual, to think through what's changed. The mindset's already shifted. What's changed? You now have an idea of the environment. But thirdly, it's actually crafting a plan. And as we know, we've always wanted business plans in the past, but more importantly now, it's having one that can be completely agile. So let's step you through a couple of those slides. On the first one, it's the mindset. And I remember when we were organizing the presentation for today, this next slide that comes through really will present to you why it is truly a mindset shift. In the respond phase, you very much have, unpredictability, constantly needing to think about what's next, but not quite sure which way you need to pivot. When you think about Thrive, what we have in front of us is somewhat here to stay. And we do know whether it's the first wave, the second wave, or potentially the third or the fourth, we've experienced that lumpiness already. So it's very much operating in a better normal. As I mentioned earlier, to me, there's nothing more important than having an agile mindset that's here to stay. It's very difficult and challenging for all of us to know what's happened in the past and not be able to pivot as quickly as we're now having to respond every single day in the roles that we have, both as individuals and as professionals across the organizations that we lead. Chapter 2 here is around the new terrain. I mentioned it previously. This is very much peering across and figuring out not only the macro trends that are in front of us, but also those trends and the implications they have on our customers, on our suppliers, and the way in which consumers are going to be buying our businesses. Some good examples of that: digitization, you can see first and foremost in the top left corner. There has been an immense amount of uptake. Look at us here today, spending time on a Zoom call, having this conversation, which in the past we probably would have done as a one-off, but now having a record amount of sessions such as this in order to ensure that we are connecting as communities out there. When you think about things like strong government, in the sector that I operate in, the amount of cross-collaboration between the government sector and the financial services sector has been profound. The impact of collaborating to not only provide government schemes through the banks, but also all of the relief programs that the financial services industry has put in place at a very rapid pace is stuff that would have been unheard of and unimaginable for most executives across the industry. That cross-collaboration, both from a government perspective, but also the blurring of the industries, has also been a major net new addition when it comes to the terrain being changed. And then lastly, the deceleration. So of course, many of us, unless you've been courageous, have necessarily jumped on a plane and spent some time going through the airports. A lot of us are going to be hesitant for quite some time, and that's here to stay. So when you unpack all the different tiles that you have here, it is very clear to see, and these are just a few of them, the impact of COVID-19 and also, I would argue, the fundamental shifts in the way we do everything. They are truly, truly different times, and when we look ahead, some of these are very much here to stay. And then the third chapter in the journey to Thrive is spending time strategically planning. And of course, we say this during a normal cycle, spend the time strategically thinking. Now more than ever, it's important to spend time bringing your leadership teams together, spending time around the kitchen table, having a conversation about where things are today and where they're potentially going to be in the future. For business consumers out there, critically important to assess not only the cost dynamic, but also where are those new net revenue streams coming from? What are the new types of products and solutions in this new era that we all operate in that you could reimagine? We've seen a huge influx, examples such as Peloton, which previously, quarter on quarter, I think they've had an annual increase of 60%. It has been an immense amount of growth and class sizes in excess of 20,000. That is unheard of when it comes to exercise programs of the traditional norm. couple of examples such as that, and there's just such a plethora of them to share. We all know that truly this has been a remarkable transformation across every single industry and sector out there. So strategically planning, whether it's through a formal structure, a lab format, bringing people together at distances in order to really think through what are the choices that need to be made ahead in order to chart the plan forward. And then the last piece on the third chapter is to connect the dots back to what both Jen and Fatima have spent time thinking about. It's trust. Trust from your employees, it's trust from your consumers, it's the brand experience if you are a business owner that people expect of you that's here to stay. It was critical then, but I would argue it is absolutely even more critical now. With that, I think I'm going to hand it back to Shaez.
Perfect. Thank you to our subject matter experts for providing such great insight and knowledge on this very important topic. The next portion and kind of final portion, what we'll do is I've seen a number of questions sort of come in from the attendees here. So I think it's important that we walk through some of these questions to gain some further insight, and I'll jump right into them. You know, we spoke, or you spoke a lot about trust driving loyalty and how lack of trust essentially costs businesses a significant amount of money. One of the questions that arose was, can trust really be measured? And if yes, how can we really go about this process? I assume that might be for Jennifer and Fatima.
Sure, I'll jump in, and then Fatima, feel free to jump in.
Sure.
This is an important question because we tried many different ways to measure trust, and where we landed was that you needed a comprehensive set of indicators that were more than just share price, revenue, shareholder value, NPS scores to drive the business. The way that we've seen it manifest itself, and Deloitte actually has spent time building something called the Trust IQ, which is essentially a trust platform that monitors indicators. But the only reason I bring that up is because we went through the journey of having to figure out what the right indicators were. So one is very much around diversity and inclusion. How diverse is your organization? How inclusive are they? How do you measure that through a key set of KPIs? What about the impact that your organization has on climate change in ESG, which is environmental and social governance? How are you impacting the environment, contributing or not contributing to climate change? Because that ties back to purpose. Purpose in your organization, I mentioned earlier, links your employees' hearts and your consumers' hearts together and drives loyalty in the organization in addition to your communities and your shareholders. And then finally, all the meat and potatoes of an organization. How robust is your cybersecurity, your privacy protocols? How are you protecting your stakeholders' data? And also, how are you then really putting the customer at the center of everything that you do? Those are just examples of a comprehensive set of indicators that you need to consider as a leader. That's very, very different than just what your share price is. Fatima, do you have any other thoughts?
No, I think that is very well said, Jen. What we find is a lot of organizations are saying, so we know that trust is an issue in certain areas, so what? And how are you actually going to help me in terms of being able to assess where I am on the scale? So we talk about it, Jen mentioned Trust IQ, but we talk about it in the context of almost like a health check, trust health check. So if you're concerned about reputational risk, we can help you assess that. But this is where clients are, companies are. It's in the context of what we're noticing, diversity is inclusion, a big one. Management and boards, how are they interacting with each other and do they trust? What is employees' perceptions of organizations? How does the customers actually view you? And then a very important thing is, where does your brand rank? So those are some of the examples, and hopefully that's a so what question.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. One final piece is, this is about bringing internal organizational data together with external data.
Yeah.
So as part of our thinking, we've realized that you can't just measure an organization internally and exclusively internally. We've actually used sensing platforms now that go out and scrape data off the web and from news sources around the world, and they aggregate it by region to say, this is what the external market's saying about you, this is what your people are saying about you, let's bring it together. and let's assess whether you're a trusted organization. So it's much more complex than the traditional indicators.
And Jen, one other comment is really about speed of response. Historically, we could say, let's gather all the facts, analyze, and then get back. Now you don't have that. You don't have the luxury of time anymore. You really do have, to Jen says, the sensing capabilities where you can respond in a very timely manner.
I think the only thing I'd love to just jump in for a second. This is the challenge, Shaez, that we love to talk, the three of us. We're going to talk together tonight. I think the only other thing I'd add to that is it feels like quite an out there topic, trust, right? It almost feels like you can't grapple it. And maybe previously it would have felt a bit fluffy, but it's so real. And as Jen has kind of outlined, the key indicators, like now more than ever, data is in front of us at every single interaction. So putting together those elements together to figure it out for yourself, I think that there were originally a lot of people who thought, what is this all about? And now, as Jen has experienced through a number of different client interactions, people are really waking up to the criticalness of getting this right.
Yeah, and it goes to the heart of the question too, because I don't think that CEOs or leaders are grappling with the definition of trust. They're grappling with how. How do I measure it? How do I action it? How do I monitor it so I can get ahead of it? Because Fatima gave some excellent examples of CEOs that have gotten fired for actions that weren't even on company time, right? There's monitoring. So there suddenly the corporation has been put at the center of trust, whether we liked it or not. And so our conduct is being held at a different standard.
It's interesting, the stat you threw out based on this, because I think there's an assumption that can be made that trust can sometimes be this intangible asset. Whereas at the outset of your presentation, you quantified the significant losses you can experience that could essentially impact your organization with the lack of trust, especially within human capital. And I don't think there's a full realization across the spectrum of that.
Shaez, I would jump in, and I know Jen always mentions the who owns trust in an organization, right? And often enough, when you ask that question, people point in many different directions. And then it really boils down to, for instance, if there's a cybersecurity risk, they'll go to the CIO, right? Or if there's something to do with employees, it'll be the CHRO. But that is also something that we're noticing organizations are beginning to ask the question, who ultimately owns trust? Is it the CEO? Is it the board? Is it the C-suite? Where does it reside? Or is there joint ownership of it? So that's just something for people to consider as well.
No, absolutely. It's there's so many different facets, and I think it's just all interconnected, and it kind of leads to the next question. There's this great overview provided again towards the beginning of the presentation, where trust is multidimensional. You have these 4 human dimensions of trust that are physical, digital, emotional, and financial in nature. The question is really around how can we use the Thrive framework to make strategic and investment decisions?
I can jump in, and then ladies, feel free to jump in. Raman showed a slide on the key shifts that are affecting almost all the industries. So if I were in someone's shoes who was looking to make a strategic investment, the first question I'd be asking is, these shifts, where are their threats and where are their white spaces? Okay, so if the target you're looking for, the investment you're looking for happens to be in the digital space, the evaluation is, where do I think digital is going to go? And do I believe that it's going to disrupt across a number of industries? So that thesis of these shifts that she showed, having a thesis on each is critical. So that's one. The second is it going to be part of a broader portfolio, or are you making a one-off investment that's going to be outside of your existing business? Because placing bets and this concept of bold bets is going to be is important. And organizations, at least the ones I'm working with, are starting to think through, how do I reinvent my business model? So if I have to sit with a white piece of paper, if I could redesign my business again today, what would I have done differently? So I'll give you an example. If you think of someone like Spin Master, right, which is typically a toy company that makes traditional toys and sells through the retail channel. striking a deal with Netflix, creating content. Suddenly you're in a consumer technology business, content business. Just an example, right? If you look at someone like Shopify, you're starting to see e-commerce, consumer, small business all come together perfectly in a pandemic environment. They just announced today that they doubled their Q3 revenue, which was just crazy. And the reason I say that is it's the crossover of industries and understanding those shifts that has created the value. I think organizations that are looking to just make strategic investments as tuck-ins, let's call them, it's not a bad move, but those aren't the bold moves. Bold moves is how do I create something that wasn't there before? That's the way I would think about it. And she showed an excellent view on shifts and also that mindset shift. And those 4 steps that she laid out were exactly the steps that a management team needs to go through to think through their strategic investment.
Excellent. You know, I'll kind of lead this into the next, staying on this topic of trust. We've obviously been hit with a global pandemic that has created many challenges and obstacles for individuals to overcome, and people are faced with adversity that they need to essentially overcome. On this notion of trust, how do you build trust with financial institutions, banks, lenders during this unprecedented time?
I think Raman can take that one. She's our financial services expert.
Exactly.
And just to go back to your question, you mean as clients of Shaez?
Yes, absolutely. As clients of.
Yeah, I would encourage this if we weren't in a pandemic, or if we are in a pandemic, or whatever is here to come, which is be completely transparent and get ahead of it. It's so critically important. Having run large commercial banking businesses around the world, the last thing we want ever is clients who don't feel that you can reach out and have workable plans. And a lot of the banks that I'm working with across the industry are now trying to actually even get ahead of clients so they themselves can preempt the question and say, hey, understand that you might have a challenge with XYZ. Here's how we could potentially help work through this scenario. So I do think, while I think the short-term response was all of the government stimulus packages, whether it was CEBA or BCAP, so on and so forth, yes, they were out there, but I do think that having reflected on the take-up rates for some of those programs, it's clear to see that Canadian businesses have been quite conservative in some regard and have actually tried to weather the storm throughout the entire period, which somewhat reflects the way that Canadians operate in general. And I do think that, you know, now as those programs will be wrapping up at some point in the future, and as we've described here, each of the business owners that are on this line are going to be thinking about charting their path to thrive. It's important to share those plans with relationship managers at the banks, because it's so important that they understand and digest it, because ultimately those relationship managers are the ones who are putting the case forward to the adjudication teams. So being ahead of it, spending the time to educate, and remembering one of the points on the slide that I was talking about, the different sectoral shifts. It's one thing that your business might have had a sectoral shift, but please, please, please think about your buyers and your suppliers, because it's that supply chain impact that I think sometimes people forget to think through, which is so important when you think about the next 3 years, the next 5 years in the way to manage your business. But my biggest piece of advice is make sure that you treat them as a partner.
Raman, I will also add, as we actually went through the pandemic and we spoke about digital trust, which also an emotional trust, most large financial institutions are reimagining their real estate footprint. And it sounds, yes, that's great. People are becoming with electronic and e-commerce platforms, but there's also an element of their constituents or their customers that may be aging and maybe not exactly very technology savvy, or they could be in different parts of the world where access to the internet is actually not there. So you've got to think of the impact of some of the areas or demographics that your bank is actually operating in, or your financial institutions are operating in. So again, any decisions, whether it's an organization or companies are making, they've got to think about the broader impact, because you'll say reducing your real estate footprint, that's great, you know, you save on all the costs, but you could also be disenfranchising or isolating a large community, which something needs to be looked at.
It sounds like the overall idea is to essentially just be proactive rather than reactive, and stay in touch and trust and build these institutions up as partners within your regime. So something to really importantly note. Raman, I'm going to stay with you for a second on this journey you spoke about as you go from responding to recovering to thrive. How do you know if your organization is essentially ready to transition from the phase of responding to COVID into the phase of planning for thrive?
Yeah, great question. And I'm going to tap Jen to help augment. From my perspective, I think there's a little bit of a gut feel on this, but more importantly, particularly as you're emerging through, as I had the 3 stages, we've got respond, recover, and thrive. Out of recovery, there's a little bit more stability happening across the various things, the environmental factors that we talked about, that starts allowing for the capacity for you to have room to think about thrive. So I do think that there's not a natural, move from here to here. I think that they are concurrent. Jen, I'm hoping you're nodding and saying yes at the same time. And then you start transitioning specifically into thrive. And then, as now this will be the 3rd time I use this word, agility, ensuring that there's agility through the thrive phase, because it's not going to be stable. There is nothing in my own mind when we think about the future that's going to be stable. So being able to be responsive throughout those phases. So I don't think it's as clean cut. Jen, would you agree?
Yeah, Raman was spot on. And I would just add, there's probably 3 major areas leaders need to think about. One is, how do you reduce uncertainty, whether you're in respond, recover, and thrive? Because as Raman said, you won't know what phase you're in, right? You're just going to sort of buckle down and hope for the best. So how do you do that? Well, you create scenarios. What are the 3 scenarios that I think my business is going to go through? What's the best, worst case, and middle case? By doing that, you're reducing the uncertainty and you're helping the organization come out of a recover phase into respond, and then you'll see the uptick, which is the fruits of your planning to get into thrive. So that's an important characteristic, a tangible thing that leaders can do. The second thing that you can do is you have to also decide what skill sets you're going to need as you plan for each of the scenarios. The same team that was in recover may not be the same team that was in respond may not be the same team in recover, and they may not be the same team in thrive. Earlier on, Fatima talked about not only trust, but diversity of thought. You may need operators and people who can buckle down, and that might be a homogeneous team in the respond phase. But when you get to recover and thrive, this diversity of thought becomes critical to place those strategic bets, which we talked about earlier. And the final piece is around trust. How do you actually develop a trusted team along those 4 dimensions? Because you're asking the organization to follow you in a world where it's uncertain. In order to do that, if you don't have followership, you're dead in the water, because there's too much. The uncertainty makes people nervous and can bring out bad behavior. So if you don't have the right trusted team that can work together, bring the diversity of thought, different perspectives, bring voices to the table, you're going to have a very, very hard time getting into the recover stage and eventually into the thrive stage. I don't know, Fatima, if I missed anything.
No, I think that was very well summarized. Thank you.
Just for my understanding, if I can sort of harp on this a little bit more, when you speak to this phase from recovery to thrive, it sounds like organizations have to be ready to pivot, because you said that the same management team or structure that you had potentially through the recovery stage may not be the same team when you hit through to the thrive stage. Is that fair to say?
It is, and and so you may have to run concurrent teams as a result. And that's a very, very different approach than most organizations. Usually the management team is the management team. And Fatima may be able to speak from a board perspective. That may require you to have different skill sets at the board level too. And so I don't know, Fatima, if you want to comment.
No, I think that's an excellent question. From a board perspective, what we're also seeing, not only within our own organization, but all organizations we work with, there are different issues that are coming up. And remember, there's no roadmap. This is new, right? The Spanish flu was many, many, many decades ago. So people don't have a clear roadmap. You can't say I'm learning from another industry. You're literally failing fast. You're making decisions and you're actually having to experiment as you go. You find that the issues about, especially with trust, it's becoming a lot bigger. I think earlier I alluded to the fact about just shareholder value and about a wealth of an organization. That's changed. We are hit with a lot of things like we got to worry about cyber risk. We got to worry about employee and consumer activism. We got to worry about diversity and inclusion. We've got to worry about your media coverage and what's happening with the brand. And then you also have to worry about what are your consumers and your employees thinking about your stance on climate, right? There's all these things that has to be assessed. And we speak about the stakeholders again. Every stakeholder matters now. You can't ignore one at the expense of the other. And the boards that are focusing on these issues are the boards that are going to be exceptionally successful going forward.
Excellent. There's been a flurry of questions I can tell you on trust. We've had, obviously we've already spoken a bit about the impact of not having trust within your organization and building trust, whether it's through human capital. But as far as best practices go, there's some inquiry or inquisitivity, I should say, around what is the most efficient way to build physical trust.
Yeah, I can jump in on that one. The grocery industry was actually the best industry to respond in a physical manner. So I'll highlight a few. One is that the constant sanitization that was happening during COVID built trust in the employees mostly, because the customers really weren't showing up at the grocery store, right? But if you look at the numbers, someone like Loblaws spent $400 million just in COVID-related physical safety measures. That's a significant undertaking. They also increased the minimum wage by $2, as I mentioned earlier. It's again a significant financial investment. And by putting the plexiglass up, they were the first ones to put not Loblaws, but the grocery industry put the plexiglass up for safety. They were not only running very sort of surgical shifts on how they were going to manage the floor in the stores, how they were going to ramp up their digital capabilities so that customers didn't have to come into the store, how they picked product. They did it very carefully under very strict COVID conditions, up to the lineups right outside the store and how they managed capacity in the store. Like, let's face it, retail is about traffic. So by actually managing your traffic outside the store is the fastest way to kill your business, right? So those are examples of measures that are taken. Now you're seeing on the flip side in office buildings, how do you demonstrate that you're building trust? Well, we have not only the track and trace capabilities, but the ability to say to your employees, you don't have to come in if you don't feel comfortable. The flexibility, you choose what is best for you and your family. And also the fact that, organizations, I can only speak for Deloitte, we gave people technology allowances to go buy proper headsets because we recognize that they're all working from home, right down to how do you have wellness programs that actually help you on your physical safety? Not only sitting for 16 hours a day in front of a computer, but also you're managing your own mental health, which is also your physical health. How do we try and help our employees try and thrive in this very difficult time? Those are just examples of where financial investment demonstrated that they were investing in your physical safety.
Jen, the one other example I'll probably maybe just highlight for your interest, lots of us love to travel, right? Hospitality sector, and everybody knows travel and hospitality is a sector that has been decimated. And there are large hotel chains and luxury brands that are thinking of guest safety and how do they get and encourage people to come back into the hotels. And you're seeing some very creative ideas of people, organizations and chains, partnering with like different universities to research so they can build trust, and then but in turn guests will start basically going to their hotels, right? So it's every industry is grappling with it, and there's some fascinating examples. But as I said before, there is no roadmap. Everyone is actually figuring things out as we go.
I think the good thing about this also is that it's forced people to really go back to the human experience, whether it's customers or employees. What does it feel like? There's been such material shifts, just if you think about support for working parents with young kids across every single industry, right? It's been a big struggle, particularly when kids were not in school. And at least, you know, our own organization, and I know many of the banks and financial services organizations that I work with all jumped on this. And they didn't have to, but and it's not necessarily an obligation, but they recognize that their employees as human beings who happen to be parents also have this additional burden. So really being empathetic to need across the spectrum of stakeholders has been pivotal.
Thank you. No, I think so, you know, some of these practices and experiences you all are sharing are definitely going to obviously benefit the attendees on this call, and especially myself. It's just very interesting to note how multidimensional trust is. On to the sort of the company side here, with the rise of consumer, employee, and social activism, what can companies do to help?
Do you want to take that one, Fatima?
For you, Jen or Fatima?
I think Jen mentioned the sensing exercises. I mean, even as an organization like Deloitte, we constantly assessing our brand and what's being said. And, you know, you figure out one platform and there's 10 others that come up. You know, people are all over Reddit to see what's being said about the organization. The real big point here goes back to the concept of trust. You know, you do the right thing all the time, not only when the camera's on. I think in the context of, you know, we say, do it, you know, if you see something, say something, but it's also do something about it, because your employees are going to hold you accountable for it. Your customers are going to hold you accountable. And Jen can talk to all the different sensing tools that are out there, but there's some fascinating aids that are available where companies do need to pay attention. And if you don't have the expertise, probably ask people for help.
Yeah, I think Fatima brings up an excellent point. I think the recognition that the leaders are now accountable is probably the first big step, because a lot of the time I think the corporate world kind of said, it wasn't my problem, I don't need to deal with it. That's one. The second is that the bringing together of the data sets to help inform the conversation. It's not going to give you the answer, but it's going to cause the so what discussion. That is important at the leadership table because it's demonstrating a mindset shift, which Raman talked about earlier. And then finally, actually running the scenarios of what happens if we run into this situation, what are we going to do about it? Helps articulate what a playbook could be to respond. It won't be perfect, but at least you're starting to shift the mindset to the how. What are we going to do? So those are the three big moves I would make if I was the leader of an organization to make this real.
Excellent. Just back on this pandemic side of things, pretty straightforward in this aspect. Fatima, how do employees essentially return to work safely?
Wow. Okay. I would say with COVID and with lots of people spending time listening and following social media and the news, I think we have people really concerned about health and safety, but also there's been the rise of, I would say, conspiracy theories. You walk around and every employee will probably even tell you about all the side effects of COVID or surface touching and things like that. I can share what we've done at Deloitte in the context of really engaging with the employees in terms of what's important by doing pulse surveys. You know, asking them they want to come back to work or they're going to work from home. Most people opted. We've got a significant portion of our population. I think it's more than 75% of our employees right now saying they want to work from home. It's about a choice as well, right? We obviously live in a democracy and people need to have a freedom to do that. And it's also about being responsible. So you find as employers, we tend to we over-rotate on being responsible. And giving our employees the tools and decision making that actually doesn't go against them. We've also got the other extreme where people are social creatures. People want to come in all the time, right? And we've had to put strict protocols in place. I don't think Deloitte is unique in this. As I've been speaking to a lot of my clients, it's exactly the same thing. I mentioned there's a large hotel chain. They decided to open their offices in September, and they, because they were concerned about a lot of their employees that are, mental health issues, alone at home, at least giving them a choice to come back to the office. And for the first 3 weeks when they tracked it, there was only about 5% of the employees was returning. So they decided to say, close it down. The cost of running the offices was actually just too much. I go back to the comments that we've made earlier. There's a lot of uncertainty, but the uncertainty is here to stay. Hopefully, as we get better with the science and there's a vaccine, I think there'll be a lot more trust in the system. Jen, any comments on your part?
I think that's a great comment. I would add, we have to challenge our assumptions too as leaders. We had this assumption that people needed to be in the office and needed to show their face to be effective, to be highly productive. And we found that's not the case, even the most traditional industries. So if the leader's on the phone, I would challenge them to say, are the operating models that we're running today, can they be challenged under COVID? Can we run a more efficient model, a more engaging model? And maybe it's not about physical space. And this is our chance to use technology and try different things, because people understand that in COVID, it's about learning and trying. So you get a lot of forgiveness if at least you're making an effort with your employees and your customers. And the final piece is communication. The retail industry actually did a great job on this, constantly showing that they're sanitizing, that they are allowing their employees to have flexibility. Like, that's very important, showing it, because people are no longer, interacting in an office and, the water cooler isn't there. So how much more can you communicate so that they understand? That's key.
And collaboration, right? This whole idea of top down, where the employer has all the knowledge and they're just going to dictate it from the top, it doesn't work, right? It actually really is about the buy-in and getting and sharing of ideas. And you cannot believe how that actually instills trust in, even with your customers, but even with your employees.
It very much has broken down those hierarchies that used to exist before across every single industry. And having been a former banker, there's lots of hierarchy in banks. It's definitely turned it on its head.
With now, just staying on this for a bit, curious even for myself, is with individuals working more remotely, and even if efficiency has stayed at an increased pace, do you think there's been a negative impact on collaboration and teamwork without the physical interaction of being in that office space and brainstorming and sharing ideas within the boardroom? Or do you think this can still be achieved remotely?
I'll give my perspective. I think people will have their different views. I've always been of the mindset that work is not where you go to, it's what you do. So if you people are more effective working remotely at home, then that's great. Or they could be at a beach somewhere, that's even okay. It often depends. It's not, I don't believe it's a one size fits all. I think each individual had their different stages in their lives. People want that flexibility. But what I do think the pandemic has done, it's accelerated a lot of traditional thinking, where people were really resistant to the whole idea of having an entire workforce, work from home or work remotely, to now sort of saying, actually, this can be done. I mean, I'm also seeing in the context of how boards are conducting themselves. Think about it. You always had to get together. We traveled to a location, and now you're finding you're doing breakouts, board sessions. Your consent agendas, everything is happening at speed, right? So it's quick and it's absolutely doable. Are there downsides to it? Again, human beings are social creatures, right? So we always look for those ways to connect. But I do think there's going to be a lot of innovation in the making, is what my view is.
The only thing I add to that, so I agree, and Fatima used the word, it depends. I do think that by default, we have become a little bit too transactional though through Zoom calls, because we end up jumping on a call, dealing with the thing, and not having that same level of just before the meeting or just after the meeting, just common engagement. And where you worked with, the three of us know each other because we knew each other before COVID, we've got a comfort level in knowing each of our individual stories and spending time together. It becomes extremely hard if it's a new client or if it's a new coworker who's joining. And so I think that the trick in this is still figuring out how do you create that experience of human bonding that normally happens in person. And just a quick case in point example, I had a 30-minute Zoom call with a client that we switched to the patio because here in Toronto it was 26 degrees last Friday. So we gave it a go and it was 3 hours. So on a Zoom call, very transactional. Yeah. 3 hours, we sat on the patio and talked about so many things that really allowed for the fluidity of the human connection.
Yeah, I'll close with I agree with that. I would say from a career perspective, it creates opportunity because if I want to go talk to somebody in China and learn about their experiences, it's so easy to get somebody from China on a phone call now because they're not jumping on a plane and have to work out their schedule, etc. So in terms of collaboration, even the way we've served our clients, I'm running an assignment right now for a global athleisure company, and we have 3 countries on the phone every night trying to work out a problem. And I think that back in the day, that would have been a challenge because we'd all have to fly, we had to figure out how you're going to manage the cost of it, where like what time can we meet, jet lag. So I think that that model's changed. So if I was a younger person looking at this saying, how do I not feel isolated? How do I not feel like this is going to kill my career? Think about how do you use the tools to ask people, can I get 30 minutes of your time to listen about your career journey? Can I learn more about you and get to know you? And at least you have 30 minutes dedicated with your person's attention. And so there are opportunities in that regard. And then when we come out of this pandemic and we can once see each other again, imagine the global connections you'd have to one day meet in person. So it just creates a different type of opportunity. And I hope that the younger individuals who are still building their careers I hope it's not a feeling of hopelessness, because people are much more open today to sit on a Zoom call and get to know people.
I think that's such a solid point, Fatima. I didn't even clock that. Sorry, Jen. It's global organizations are going to thrive because of this. And so I do think with the largely Canadian audience here, if you are a business owner, starting to think about consumers and suppliers in other geographies that you can connect with like that.
Yeah,
100%. These types of means. It's definitely the place to be.
It sounds like, from everything I'm hearing, obviously this pandemic has created challenges, but the benefit that's come out of it is that we've advanced from a digital aspect, individually, professionally, in the business world. And it sounds, from the comments I'm hearing, that we can really leverage and utilize this momentum in the current environment to advance our businesses in the future. So that's really interesting to note. I want to be cognizant of everyone's time. I know we're slightly over. We'll do one more question here and then a brief wrap up. But it's been a very insightful evening. Just on diversity and inclusion. How is diversity and inclusion being addressed in corporate Canada in the wake of recent events?
Fatima.
Fatima, take that
one. Sure. So I'm going to answer it in 2 ways. The one is, I know I didn't put that in my bio, but I'm originally from South Africa. So everybody knows that's the country of Mandela, and I'm very proud of it. That was a country where discrimination and apartheid was legislated, right? So when I came to Canada 20 years ago, great country, great democracy, I was I was surprised at the lack of diversity at boardroom tables and at executive levels in Canada. I mean, and 20 years later, we're still having the same conversations. So it begged the question, and I think Jen and Raman know this, I'm leading the diversity and inclusion agenda for Deloitte, especially from a client's perspective. And it's fascinating to understand, why do we think that we haven't done enough? I think individually and organizations, they do a lot of great things and lots of training is happening and talent basically getting involved and people are aware and conscious and all of that. But in the context of moving the needle, unfortunately, is when there are no real hard stats or data or government requiring change. Sometimes people are late to adapt. And it comes with, what gets measured gets action, right? In the context of trust, you've got to do the right things. So We're hearing lots of organizations talking about it, and everybody knows what needs to be done. When rubber hits the road, what's hard is doing it, right? How, it's the how, because it's really not about excluding any population. Like you're saying, you're not going to include our Caucasian men. It's really about being more inclusive. And for a long time, diversity at corporate Canada was really construed as just putting women in positions. And we all know diversity is a lot broader than that. So organizations are talking about it. That's great. But I do think we need to see more action. And unfortunately, there was a question about employee and consumer activism. You're going to see a rise in that. And the organizations that address these issues in a sensible and deliberate manner are going to be the ones that are actually going to be exceptionally successful and on the right side of history, is what I would say.
There's I love what Fatima just said, because there's a word that she and I have been talking about, and it's called inclusive growth. So it's not as if you can't grow doing things one way. You can do it in an inclusive manner. And my view is that, having studied now so many corporations who are struggling in the pandemic, the skill set that's going to matter coming out of the pandemic are those that can be creative, those who can bring diverse perspectives, and who can reimagine the business model. And those are people who have come from different cultures or different genders or different backgrounds. And if Canada does not somehow figure out that these people are assets, then they're going to leave Canada and go somewhere else, because the other countries are going to figure it out and they're going to want to take our talent. So my hope is that our leaders here on the phone can see that they need to invest in bring these people to the table, this diverse group, and be inclusive in their growth.
Yeah, well said, Jen. I would just add one comment, and I think all of us need to catch ourselves when we hear somebody saying these words. We don't have the talent. If we hear that, I think stop, because you actually have talent and gems that are hiding in plain sight. This is what I keep telling the organizations. You actually have them. You just haven't put a spotlight on them. But what's also key is when we're trying to move and make progress, you want to do that free of judgment. You don't want to shame people into submission. You really want to do it in a thoughtful and deliberate manner, so they become, they buy into the whole thing, and they do it because it's not only good, it's the right thing to do.
I have to jump in. I know it's like 9:12, but on this, Jen, myself, and Fatima have all worked across the world. And I would say, being now planted, all of us sitting in Toronto, in Canada, this is Canada's opportunity to get D&I right for the world. Truly, we have grown up in this, and we are ready to really dominate this specific agenda. I think now is the time that we really stand tall on this topic.
Absolutely. And I know I wrapped up with a bit of a loaded question, but it is a hot topic and something that, while we've created awareness, we need to do more. So, but, on behalf of the Economic Planning Board, all the participants on this webinar, Fatima, Jennifer, Raman, want to extend our gratitude and appreciation for sharing your experiences and your knowledge on this call, and obviously your time, most importantly. So I know there's a number of individuals on this call that have benefited from your knowledge and presentation today. So we want to, thank you from the bottom of our hearts. Just to wrap up quickly, is there's a lot to take away here. There's a lot to sort of digest on what was presented around trust driving loyalty and investing in your human capital via training and leadership, which can positively affect your culture and impact your bottom line. The framework around leadership that takes you through these three phases of responding and recovering and thriving, and institutions and companies being ready to pivot and head different directions if it requires that. And finally, that trust is really multiple dimensions. We spoke about the physical, the emotional, the digital, and financial aspect that individuals and companies and businesses essentially need to be looking at the full spectrum approach. They can't be, narrow-minded and just see this as one-dimensional. Lots to take away, and once again, thank you to everyone who participated. Thank you to our subject matter experts. We look forward to next week's webinar, where we'll explore what is needed to manage business continuity, reintegration into the workplace, and confront challenges faced in the post-pandemic world. With that, hope everybody has a wonderful evening, and apologies for going slightly over time today. Take care.
Thank you very much for having us.